The day Abigail Carson watched the banker nail the foreclosure notice to her father's door was the day she learned that grief could be measured in acres and dollars. It was April 1882 in Sweetwater, Wyoming territory, and the spring sun felt merciless against her pale cheeks as she stood frozen on the porch of the only home she had ever known. Her father had been dead 3 months, taken by pneumonia during the bitter winter, and now the land he had broken his back to claim was slipping through her fingers like water through a sieve. 22 years old and alone in the world, Abigail felt the weight of her father's dreams pressing down on her shoulders until she thought they might break. The banker, a thin weasel of a man named Horace Pemberton, tipped his hat to her with mock courtesy. His lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. 30 days, Miss Carson. You have 30 days to vacate the premises or settle the debt. $300 plus interest. He said it as casually as if he were discussing the weather, not ripping away everything she had left of her father's legacy. The homestead consisted of 80 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy house her father had built with his own hands, a barn that still smelled of hay and horses, and a well that never ran dry even in the driest summers. Now it would belong to the bank, and eventually to some stranger who would never know that her mother had planted the rose bushes by the front steps before she died birthing Abigail, or that her father had carved her name into the beam above the fireplace the day they moved in. Abigail's hands trembled as she unpinned the notice from the weathered wood. $300 might as well have been $3,000. She had $47 saved from selling eggs and vegetables in town, money she had been carefully hoarding to buy seed for spring planting. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. She could sell everything they owned and still come up short. The furniture, the livestock, even her mother's wedding ring would not be enough to satisfy the debt her father had incurred trying to expand the herd during the drought 2 years back. She walked into town that afternoon, her boots kicking up dust on the rutted road, her calico dress clinging to her legs in the warm breeze. Sweetwater was not much of a town, just a collection of false-fronted buildings lining a single main street. But it was where she had come every Saturday with her father to trade and gossip and pretend they were part of a community. The general store, the saloon, the livery stable, the church with its whitewashed steeple, all of it felt foreign to her now, as if she were seeing it through glass. She tried the mercantile first. Old Mr. Henderson listened to her proposal with sympathetic eyes, but shook his head. I would help if I could, Miss Carson. Truly I would. Your father was a good man. But I do not have that kind of money lying around, not with the railroad still 2 years away and business slow as molasses. She tried the livery stable next, then the boarding house, then even the saloon, standing awkwardly in the doorway because decent women did not go inside such establishments. Everywhere the answer was the same. Sympathy, but no money. No one in Sweetwater had $300 to spare, and even if they did, lending it to a single woman with no collateral was a fool's gamble. By the time the sun began to sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Abigail had exhausted every possibility she could think of. She stood outside the bank, staring at the heavy oak door as if she could will it to disappear. Horace Pemberton was inside, probably counting his money and planning how he would profit from her misfortune. The injustice of it burned in her chest like swallowed fire. Her father had worked himself to death trying to make something of that land, and now it would be stolen away by a man who had never felt the ache of muscles pushed beyond endurance or the satisfaction of watching something grow from seed to harvest. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from behind her, deep and rough, like gravel rolling downstream. She turned and found herself looking up at a man she had seen around town but never spoken to. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. His face was tanned dark by the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he was not smiling now. He wore dusty denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. A bandana was knotted loosely around his neck, and a pair of well-worn boots completed the outfit. He looked like every other cowboy who drifted through Sweetwater, except for his eyes. They were an unusual shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I do not mean to intrude," he continued, taking off his hat and holding it in his hands. His hair was dark brown, almost black and slightly too long. "But I could not help overhearing your conversation with Henderson at the mercantile. I was picking up supplies, and well, these walls are thin." Abigail felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. It was mortifying enough to be in this situation without having strangers witness her humiliation. "I do not see how that concerns you, Mr." She let the sentence trail off, waiting for him to supply his name. "Dalton! Jack Dalton!" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "And you are right, it does not concern me. But I heard you say you needed $300 to save your father's homestead, and I happen to have that much saved up from the last few cattle drives." Abigail stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to lend me $300? You do not even know me." "I know your father was Samuel Carson, and that he was a fair man who helped my boss out a few years back when we had cattle stranded in a blizzard. He opened his barn and his stores to us without asking for anything in return. I was just a green kid on my first drive, half frozen and scared witless, and your father gave me hot coffee and a place by the fire." Jack's voice softened with the memory. "I always meant to pay that kindness back, but your father died before I got the chance. Maybe this is my opportunity." "I could not possibly accept such a sum," Abigail said, even as hope fluttered dangerously in her chest. "I have no way to pay you back. The homestead is barely breaking even, and with just me to work it—" She stopped, not wanting to voice all the fears that kept her awake at night, that she was not strong enough to do a man's work, that she would fail where her father had struggled, that she was fooling herself to even try. Jack put his hat back on and met her eyes directly. "I am not offering a loan. I want to pay off your debt to the bank, clear and simple. But I do have one condition." He paused, and something flickered across his face that might have been nervousness. "I have been working cattle drives for 8 years now, ever since I was 17. I've been saving my money, dreaming about having a place of my own someday, a real home, not just a bunkhouse bed in whatever town I happen to be passing through. Your father's homestead is exactly the kind of place I've been looking for. So my condition is this: I pay off the debt, and you let me stay there. We could work the land together as partners." The proposal was so unexpected that Abigail could not immediately form a response. Her mind raced through the implications, the propriety, the sheer strangeness of a man she did not know offering to save her home and then move into it. That would not be appropriate, she finally managed. People would talk. A single woman and a man living under the same roof, unmarried. She could already hear the scandalized whispers that would follow her through town. "We could marry," Jack said, and then immediately looked as surprised as she felt by his own words. "I mean, if that would make it respectable. It would be a practical arrangement. You need help with the homestead, and I need a place to settle down. We barely know each other, but people have built marriages on less." Abigail felt dizzy. An hour ago she had been facing the loss of everything, and now a stranger was proposing marriage. It was insane. It was impossible. It was also the only option she had. "You would really do that? Marry someone you do not know? Just to have a homestead?" "I know you well enough," Jack said quietly. "I have seen you in town over the years. You are kind to the children, patient with the elderly, and you do not gossip like some of the other women. Your father spoke of you with pride every time I saw him. He said you could read and write better than most men, that you kept the accounts for the homestead, that you had a way with animals. That is more than most people know about their spouses before they marry." It was true. Abigail knew girls who had married men their fathers chose for them, who had met their husbands only a handful of times before the wedding. At least this would be her choice, not something forced upon her by circumstance. Except it was forced by circumstance, she reminded herself. Without Jack Dalton's intervention, she would lose everything. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "This is a great deal to take in all at once." "Of course," Jack said immediately. But Pemberton gave you 30 days. I will be in town for the next week, staying at the boarding house. You can find me there when you have decided." He tipped his hat to her again and turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. "For what it is worth, Miss Carson, I think you are braver than you give yourself credit for. Not many people would fight as hard as you have been fighting today." That night, Abigail lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams her father had hewn from pine trees he had felled himself. The house creaked and settled around her, familiar sounds that usually comforted her, but tonight only reminded her how alone she was. She thought about Jack Dalton's proposal, turning it over in her mind from every angle. Marriage to a stranger was a risk, but what choice did she really have? She could refuse his help and lose the homestead, try to find work in town as a seamstress or a teacher perhaps, live in a cramped room above someone's shop, and spend the rest of her life regretting that she had not fought harder for her father's legacy. Or she could accept, take a chance on this cowboy with the kind eyes who claimed to remember her father's generosity. She rose before dawn, as she always did, and went about her morning chores with automatic efficiency. The chickens needed feeding, the cow needed milking, the kitchen needed tidying. In the gray pre-dawn light, everything looked shabby and worn. The paint was peeling on the window frames. The fence around the vegetable garden sagged in places. There was so much work to be done, more than she could manage alone, even if she worked from sunup to sundown every day. She carried the milk bucket back to the house and set it on the kitchen table, then made herself a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. The coffee was weak because she was rationing the grounds, trying to make them last. This was her life now. Small economies and constant worry, and the slowly crushing weight of responsibility she could not carry by herself. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, Abigail had made her decision. She changed into her Sunday dress, the blue one with the white collar that her father had always said made her eyes look like summer sky, and pinned up her honey-brown hair with extra care. If she was going to agree to marry a man she barely knew, she could at least look presentable while doing it. The ride into town took an hour on her father's old mare, and she used the time to rehearse what she would say. It needed to be clear and businesslike. This was a practical arrangement, not a romance. She would accept his help and his partnership, but she would also establish boundaries and expectations. They would work together to make the homestead prosper, but beyond that she would ask nothing of him, and he should expect nothing of her beyond common courtesy. The boarding house was a 2-story structure at the end of Main Street, run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, who had a reputation for strict rules and excellent biscuits. Abigail had never been inside before, and she hesitated on the front steps, gathering her courage. A respectable woman did not call on a single man at his lodgings, but then a respectable woman also did not agree to marry a stranger to save her homestead. She had already stepped outside the bounds of propriety. She might as well keep going. Mrs. Fletcher answered her knock with a look of surprise that quickly transformed into knowing speculation. "Miss Carson, what brings you here this morning?" "I need to speak with one of your guests, Mr. Jack Dalton. Is he available?" Abigail kept her voice steady, meeting the older woman's curious gaze without flinching. "He is out back, tending to his horse. I will show you." Mrs. Fletcher led her through the narrow hallway and out to the small yard behind the boarding house, where a lean-to served as a stable. Jack was there as promised, brushing down a handsome buckskin gelding with easy practice strokes. He looked up when he heard footsteps, and his face registered surprise when he saw Abigail. "Miss Carson, I did not expect to see you so soon." "I have made my decision," Abigail said, before she could lose her nerve. "I accept your proposal. I will marry you, and we can work the homestead together as partners." Jack set down the brush and walked toward her, his expression serious. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel pressured into this. If you need more time—" "I do not have more time, and yes, I am certain, but I have conditions of my own." She had practiced this speech during the ride into town. "This will be a marriage of convenience, an arrangement that benefits us both. You will have your homestead, and I will keep my father's land. We will be partners in the work, sharing the labor and the profits equally. Beyond that, I expect respect and honesty, and I will give you the same in return." "That sounds fair," Jack said slowly. "And what about the other aspects of marriage? Children and—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to maintain eye contact. "We can decide that later when we know each other better. For now, separate bedrooms." "Agreed." Jack extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Abigail shook it. His hand was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not crushing. "I will go to the bank this morning and settle your debt. We can be married by the end of the week if that suits you." Everything moved quickly after that, with the unstoppable momentum of a boulder rolling downhill. Jack accompanied Abigail to the bank, where he counted out $300 in gold and silver coins while Horace Pemberton watched with an expression of deep displeasure. The banker had no doubt been looking forward to acquiring the Carson homestead, and now his plans were thwarted by a cowboy with more money than Pemberton had anticipated. Abigail watched the transaction with a mixture of relief and unreality. Just like that, the debt that had been crushing her was wiped away. The homestead was safe. They were married 4 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Sweetwater. The ceremony took place in the small white church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Fletcher and the general store owner serving as witnesses. Abigail wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk for all these years, letting out the seams because she was taller than her mother had been. The dress was silk the color of cream, simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a high neck. Jack wore his cleanest clothes and a new shirt he had purchased for the occasion, dark gray that brought out the color of his eyes. The preacher was an elderly man with a booming voice who seemed determined to pack as much religious instruction as possible into the ceremony. He spoke at length about the duties of husbands and wives, about mutual submission and godly love, about the sanctity of the marriage bond. Abigail barely heard him. She was too aware of Jack standing beside her, tall and solid and real. This was happening. She was marrying this man. When the preacher finally got around to the vows, her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "I, Abigail Marie Carson, take you, Jack William Dalton, to be my lawfully wedded husband." Jack's voice was equally steady as he repeated his vows, and then he was slipping a simple gold band onto her finger, and the preacher was pronouncing them man and wife. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher announced cheerfully. Jack looked at Abigail with a question in his eyes, and she gave a small nod. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, brief and chaste, but even that fleeting contact sent a shock of awareness through her. His lips were warm and surprisingly soft, and when he pulled back, she caught the faint scent of soap and leather, and something else she could not name. Then it was over, and they were married, bound together by law and by necessity. They rode back to the homestead together, Jack on his buckskin and Abigail on her mare, leading a pack horse loaded with Jack's belongings. He did not own much, just his saddle and tack, a bedroll, a few changes of clothes, and a wooden box that held personal items he did not elaborate on. It was strange, Abigail thought, how completely someone's life could fit into a few bundles. For 8 years, Jack had been living out of saddlebags, never staying in one place long enough to accumulate the weight of possessions. Now he would have a home, roots, a future that extended beyond the next cattle drive. When they reached the homestead, Jack spent a long moment just looking at it, taking in the house and the barn and the fields stretching away toward the mountains. "It is a fine place," he said quietly. "Your father built something worth being proud of." "He thought so," Abigail agreed. "He used to say this land was his legacy to me, the only thing of value he had to leave behind. I could not let it go without a fight." She dismounted and led her mare to the barn, suddenly nervous about being alone with this man who was now her husband. "I put fresh linens on the bed in the spare room. It is not large, but it should be comfortable enough." They spent the rest of the day in a strange dance of politeness, both of them trying to navigate the awkwardness of their situation. Jack insisted on cooking supper, surprising Abigail with his competence in the kitchen. You learn to cook when your choices are that or starve, he explained with a slight smile. Chuck wagon food is not fancy, but it fills your belly. He made a simple stew with salt pork and potatoes and carrots from a root cellar, and they ate at the kitchen table in near silence, the scrape of spoons against bowls unnaturally loud. After supper, Abigail showed him around the property in the fading light. The barn needed new shingles on the roof. The well pump needed a new washer. The fence line on the north pasture needed mending. Jack listened carefully, asking questions about the livestock and the crops, about which fields had been planted and which lay fallow. He had a practical mind, she noticed, always thinking about how things could be improved or made more efficient. By the time darkness fell, they had developed the outline of a plan for the spring planting and the work that needed to be done before the summer heat arrived. That first night in the house together was the most awkward. They lingered in the kitchen, both reluctant to be the first to retire to their separate bedrooms, as if doing so would somehow acknowledge the strangeness of their arrangement. Finally, Abigail forced herself to stand. I should turn in. Morning comes early. Abigail, Jack said, and she paused, surprised by the use of her first name. Thank you for trusting me. I know this is not the marriage you probably dreamed of as a girl, but I promise I will do right by you. I will work hard, and I will be faithful to you, and I will never give you cause to regret today. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and fled to her bedroom. Once the door was closed behind her, she sank onto the edge of the bed and let out a shaky breath. She had done it. She had married a stranger to save her home. Now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the relentless demands of the homestead. Jack proved to be as hard a worker as he had promised, rising before dawn and laboring until dark. He repaired the barn roof and fixed the well pump and mended miles of fence line. He had a gift for working with animals, gentling them with patience and quiet words. The horses responded to him immediately, and even the cows seemed calmer when he was around. Abigail found herself watching him when she thought he would not notice, observing the competent way he handled tasks that would have taken her twice as long and left her exhausted. They worked side by side most days, plowing the fields for planting, hauling rocks to repair the fence, mucking out the barn. It was back-breaking labor, but Jack never complained and never suggested that any task was beneath him. He treated Abigail as an equal partner, asking her opinion on decisions and listening when she explained how her father had managed things. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the awkwardness between them began to ease. They talked while they worked, tentative at first and then with growing comfort. Jack told her about his life on the cattle drives, the long months on the trail pushing stubborn steers north to market, the dust and heat and occasional danger. He spoke of friends he had made and lost, of stampedes and river crossings and narrow escapes from rustlers. Abigail in turn told him about growing up on the homestead, about her mother who had died when she was too young to remember much more than a soft voice and gentle hands. She told him about her father, a stern but loving man who had taught her everything he knew about working the land. He wanted a son, she admitted one afternoon as they took a break from plowing to rest in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Someone who could take over the homestead and carry on the family name. Instead, he got me. He did not seem disappointed, Jack said, taking a long drink from the water canteen. Every time he spoke of you, his face lit up. He was proud of you, Abigail, do not doubt that. The words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She had been so consumed with grief and worry since her father's death that she had not let herself remember the good times, the moments of connection and love. I miss him, she said quietly. Every single day I miss him. I know. Jack's voice was gentle. I lost my parents when I was 16, both of them to cholera within a week of each other. The grief never completely goes away, but it does get easier to carry. As April gave way to May, the homestead began to transform under their combined efforts. The fields were planted with wheat and corn and oats. The vegetable garden flourished under Abigail's attentive care. Jack bought a small herd of cattle at auction, using the last of his savings, and they grazed contentedly in the north pasture. The homestead was prospering in a way it had not for years, and Abigail began to feel something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She also began to feel something else, something she had not anticipated and was not entirely comfortable acknowledging. She was becoming aware of Jack not just as a business partner, but as a man. She noticed the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted something heavy. She noticed the way he smiled, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly higher than the other. She noticed his hands, strong and capable, gentle when they needed to be. At night, lying alone in her bed, she found herself thinking about the brief kiss they had shared at their wedding, wondering what it would be like to kiss him again, to truly kiss him without the constraint of propriety and witnesses. It was confusing and a little frightening. She had agreed to a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement. Developing feelings for her husband had not been part of the plan. She tried to ignore the attraction, to focus on the work, and treat Jack with the same friendly partnership they had established. But it became harder to maintain that pretense as the weeks passed and she saw more and more of the man beneath the cowboy exterior. Jack was kind, she discovered. He brought her wildflowers he found while mending fence and left them on the kitchen table without comment. He noticed when she was tired and insisted she rest while he finished the chores. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh when she least expected it. He read books in the evening, surprising her with his love of poetry and his ability to quote long passages from memory. "My mother was a school teacher," he explained when she expressed surprise. "She made sure I could read and write before she died. Said it was the difference between being a drifter and being a man with choices." One evening in late May, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain and fierce wind. They had been working in the far pasture when the storm hit, and by the time they made it back to the house, they were both soaked to the skin and shivering. Abigail immediately went to the stove to build up the fire, but her hands were shaking so badly from the cold that she could not strike a match. Jack gently took the matches from her and lit the fire himself, then disappeared into his room and returned with a blanket that he wrapped around her shoulders. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," yes. "Go change. I will make hot coffee." When she emerged from her bedroom in dry clothes, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders because she had been too cold to bother pinning it up, Jack was in the kitchen, stripped to the waist while his wet shirt dried by the fire. Abigail stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. She had seen him without a shirt before, briefly, when he had been working in the heat of the day, but this felt different, more intimate. His body was lean and muscular, with scars here and there that spoke of a hard life. She forced her gaze away, feeling her cheeks heat. Jack seemed oblivious to her discomfort. He poured coffee for both of them and handed her a cup, his fingers brushing hers briefly. The touch sent a jolt through her, and she nearly dropped the cup. Their eyes met, and for a moment something crackled in the air between them, something electric and alive. Then Jack stepped back, breaking the connection, and cleared his throat. "The storm should pass soon. It came up fast." "Yes," Abigail agreed, grateful for the mundane topic. "The weather can be unpredictable this time of year." They stood in the kitchen, drinking their coffee and listening to the rain hammer against the roof, and Abigail wondered if Jack felt it too, this growing tension between them. She wondered if he lay awake at night thinking about her the way she thought about him. She wondered what would happen if she was brave enough to tell him that their arrangement was no longer enough, that she wanted more than partnership and practicality. But she said nothing, and the moment passed, and they went to their separate bedrooms as they always did. The turning point came in early June, on a day that started like any other. Jack had ridden into town to pick up supplies, and Abigail was in the garden weeding the rows of beans and peas. She heard the sound of horses approaching and looked up to see 3 men riding toward the house. They were rough-looking characters, unshaven and dirty, with guns on their hips and mean expressions. Abigail felt a spike of fear, but forced herself to stand and face them calmly. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The largest of the 3, A bearded man with small, cruel eyes leered at her. "Well, now, that depends. We are looking for work. Heard there might be a homestead around here that needed extra hands." "I am afraid we are not hiring," Abigail said, keeping her voice steady. "My husband and I are managing fine on our own." "Your husband, huh? And where is he?" The man looked around pointedly. "I do not see nobody but you." "He is in town. He will be back shortly." Abigail took a step back toward the house, calculating whether she could reach her father's rifle before the men could stop her. "That so?" The man dismounted, and his companions followed suit. "Maybe we will wait for him. Your hospitality, of course." He moved toward her, and Abigail retreated faster, her heart pounding. This was bad. She was alone and vulnerable, and these men clearly had no good intentions. "I think you should leave," she said, trying to inject authority into her voice. "Right now." "I do not think so," the man said, reaching for her. Abigail turned to run, but he was faster, grabbing her arm and yanking her back. She cried out and tried to pull free, but his grip was like iron. "You are a pretty little thing, are you not? Be nice, and maybe we will not burn your house down when we are done." The sound of a gunshot split the air, and the man released Abigail so suddenly that she stumbled. She looked up to see Jack on his horse at the edge of the yard, a rifle in his hands, his face set in hard lines. "Get away from my wife," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Right now, or the next shot will not be a warning." The three men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. The bearded leader scowled. "It is 3 against 1, cowboy. You sure you want to play this game?" "I am very sure," Jack said, not lowering the rifle. "And if you think I cannot take all 3 of you before you clear your holsters, you are welcome to try me." There was something in his voice, a cold certainty that made even the rough men hesitate. This was not a bluff. Jack Dalton knew how to use that rifle, and he would not miss. After a long, tense moment, the leader spat into the dirt. "Come on, boys, this place is not worth the trouble." They mounted their horses and rode off, but not before the leader turned back to shout, "You watch yourself, cowboy. We might meet again." Jack waited until they were out of sight before dismounting and rushing to Abigail. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" His hands were on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injuries, and Abigail realized she was shaking. "I am fine. They did not have time to do anything before you arrived." Her voice came out thin and reedy. "How did you know to come back?" "I saw them riding out of town, and something about them did not sit right. I hurried back just in case." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Abigail clung to him, feeling safe for the first time since the men had appeared. She could hear his heart pounding as fast as her own, and she realized he had been afraid too, afraid for her. "Thank you," she whispered against his shirt. "Thank you for coming back." "Always, Jack said fiercely. "I will always come back for you, Abigail, always." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, his eyes searching her face. "When I saw that man grab you, when I thought about what could have happened," he stopped, his jaw clenching. "I cannot lose you. I know this marriage was supposed to be just a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way it became more than that for me. Somewhere along the way I started falling in love with you." Abigail's breath caught. She stared up at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You love me?" "I do," Jack said simply. "I know I have no right to expect you to feel the same way. You married me to save your home, not because you wanted a husband, but I had to tell you the truth. I had to let you know that this is not just business for me anymore. You are not just my partner. You are my wife, and I love you." Joy bloomed in Abigail's chest, so intense it almost hurt. "Jack," she said, lifting her hand to cup his cheek, "you are not alone in this. I've been falling in love with you too. I did not want to admit it, did not want to complicate our arrangement, but I cannot help how I feel. I love you." Jack's face transformed, his smile so bright it could have lit up the night sky. "You love me," he repeated, as if he needed to hear it again to believe it. You really love me." "I really do," Abigail confirmed, and then his mouth was on hers, kissing her with a passion that made the brief peck at their wedding seem like nothing at all. This kiss was deep and hungry, full of all the longing they had both been suppressing for weeks. Abigail melted into him, letting herself feel everything she had been denying. His arms were around her, strong and secure, and she felt treasured, desired, loved. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she laughed with pure happiness. "I think our marriage of convenience just became a lot less convenient." "And a lot more interesting," Jack agreed, grinning. He kissed her again, softer this time, tender and sweet. "I want to do this right, Abigail. I want to court you properly, even though we are already married. I want to take you to town dances and buy you pretty things and make you feel cherished." "You already make me feel cherished," Abigail said, but she was smiling. "But I would not object to a town dance or two." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they did not retreat to separate bedrooms. Jack carried Abigail over the threshold of the main bedroom, the one that had been her father's and should have been theirs from the beginning, and laid her gently on the bed. He was patient and careful with her, mindful that she had never been with a man before, and when they finally came together, it felt like the consummation not just of their marriage, but of everything that had been building between them since the day he had offered to save her homestead. Afterward, lying in the darkness with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Abigail felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Partnership and passion and love all intertwined. The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness and hard work. They labored side by side under the blazing Wyoming sun, bringing in the hay and tending the growing crops. The cattle thrived, and Jack talked about expanding the herd next year, maybe even buying the adjacent parcel of land if it came up for sale. Abigail discovered that she had a knack for managing the financial side of the operation, keeping meticulous records of expenses and income, calculating yields and profits. Together they made a formidable team, and the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. They also made time for pleasure. Jack took her into town for the 4th of July celebration, where they danced to fiddle music under strings of lanterns and ate pie from the church ladies' baking contest. He taught her to ride better, to really ride, racing across the open prairie with the wind in her hair and laughter on her lips. She taught him to appreciate the simple pleasure of a quiet evening on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors while they talked about everything and nothing. In August, Abigail realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that she could really have this much happiness all at once. When she was finally certain, she told Jack over breakfast, blurting it out without preamble, "I am going to have a baby." Jack dropped his fork, his eyes going wide. "A baby? You are certain?" "I am certain." Abigail felt nervous suddenly. They had not discussed children, had not planned for this. "I know it is soon, and we have so much work to do, but But nothing," Jack interrupted, coming around the table to pull her into his arms. "This is wonderful news, Abigail, the best news. We are going to have a baby." He was grinning like a fool, and Abigail felt her anxiety dissolve. Of course Jack would be happy. He was always happy about things that mattered. "A son or a daughter," he mused. "I do not even care which, just healthy. That's all I want." The baby was born the following April, almost exactly a year after Abigail had watched the foreclosure notice being nailed to her door. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with a tuft of dark hair in his father's eyes. They named him Samuel after Abigail's father, and Jack held his son with a mixture of awe and terror, as if the tiny creature might break at any moment. "He is so small," he whispered. "How is something this small even real?" "He will grow," Abigail assured him, exhausted but glowing with happiness. "Before you know it, he will be running all over the homestead, getting into trouble." "Cannot wait," Jack said, and she could tell he meant it. He was a devoted father from the first moment, waking with Abigail for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just watching Samuel sleep. The homestead continued to prosper, and Jack hired 2 ranch hands to help with the increased workload, allowing him to spend more time with his growing family. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, a tiny red-faced thing they named Rose after Abigail's mother, and the rose bushes that still bloomed by the front steps. Then 3 years after that, another son, whom they called William, after Jack's father. The house that had once been too quiet, too empty, was now filled with noise and chaos and love. The children grew up strong and healthy, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with chores as soon as they were old enough to be useful. Abigail sometimes thought back to that terrible day when she had believed she would lose everything, and she marveled at how much her life had changed. She had gained not just a home, but a family, not just a partner, but a husband she loved more than she had ever thought possible. Jack was still the same hard-working, honest man he had been when he first offered to help her, but now she knew all the other facets of him too. His tenderness with the children, his patience when teaching Samuel to handle a rope, his gentleness when comforting Rose after a nightmare, his passion when they were alone together, the way he still looked at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world even after years of marriage and 3 babies. On their 10th anniversary, Jack surprised her with a gift. It was a painted sign that read Carson-Dalton Ranch with a border of roses carved into the wood. "I made it myself," he admitted, looking almost shy. "I wanted something that honored both our families, both our legacies. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Abigail said, tears pricking her eyes. "I think everything about our life is perfect." They hung the sign above the main gate, and it became a landmark in Sweetwater. People would give directions by saying, "Turn left at the Carson-Dalton place," or "just past where the Daltons live." The ranch continued to grow and prosper over the years, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. When Wyoming achieved statehood in 1890, Jack and Abigail celebrated with their neighbors, proud to be part of this new chapter in the region's history. Their children grew up and in time married and started families of their own. Samuel took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, showing the same dedication to the land that his grandfather and parents had possessed. Rose married a lawyer from Cheyenne and moved to the city, though she visited often with her own children. William became a veterinarian, combining his love of animals with a scientific mind, and opened a practice in Sweetwater that served the whole county. Jack and Abigail grew old together, their hands becoming gnarled with age and arthritis, but still finding each other across the dinner table, still clasping together on evening walks around the property. They watched the sunset from the porch every night, a ritual they had maintained for decades, and Jack would always tell her the same thing. "I would do it all again, you know. If I could go back to that day in 1882 and choose differently, I would not. I would find you again. I would offer to pay off that debt again. I would marry you again and fall in love with you again every single time." "I know," Abigail would say, leaning her head on his shoulder. "So would I." They lived to see their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren born. They lived to see the old homestead transform into a thriving ranch that employed dozens of people and supported multiple families. They lived to see the 20th century dawn, bringing with it automobiles and telephones and other marvels they could never have imagined in their youth. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other, their love deepening and maturing like good wine. Jack died first in his sleep at the age of 78. Lying in the bed he had shared with Abigail for over 50 years. She held his hand as he took his last breath and whispered that she would see him again soon. She followed him 6 months later, unable to bear being separated from the man who had saved her home and won her heart. They were buried side by side in the family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath a shared headstone that read, "Together in life, together in eternity." The Carson-Dalton Ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family, a lasting legacy of what 2 people could build when they combined hard work with love. And every spring, the roses planted by Abigail's mother still bloomed by the front steps of the old homestead, a reminder that some things endure no matter how much time passes. The story of Jack and Abigail became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The cowboy who paid off a debt and won a bride. The woman who married a stranger and found her soulmate. A love story born of necessity that transformed into something transcendent and eternal. Proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places.